Hello everyone, and welcome to the ABPMP webinar on Transformation That Sticks. My name is Dan Morris. I'm a member of the ABPMP International Board of Directors, and my role with the association, or part of my role with the association, is to host the monthly webinars. And just a little bit of background, I've got over 20 years of experience with this. Also the author of 5 books and a PEX columnist, and one of the people that was involved in writing the CBUC and the CBPP test. And the one announcement that I'd like to make before we continue is that the association is starting to put together a certification drive, and we're working in conjunction with major BPM conferences. First of all, to provide overview training for the CBPP, and then at the end of the course, the actual test itself. And I'll be providing more information in future webinars as we start to solidify the agreements with the different, essentially the different conference organizations. As with today, or as with all of our webinars today, the webinar will be put out, or I should say today's webinar, I'm sorry. Today's webinar will be put out in about a week on the ABPMP website, and it'll become part of the list of webinars then that we have available to our members on a demand basis. Now, we'll hold questions to the end, but please key them in as they occur to you. And the session itself is scheduled for 1 hour. But one of the things that we like to do is make sure that we can answer as many questions as we possibly can for those who participate in the webinar. So if we go over an hour answering questions, that's fine, as long as everybody wants to stay in and have that discussion. We'll be fine, and we'll work that out. The questions that may come up as you think about the discussions today, even after the webinar itself is, those questions can either be sent to me, or they can be sent to one of the presenters today, and they'll get back to you with answers to those questions. Information on how to contact the presenters will be provided at the end of the webinar. In the event that you have any technical issues, drop a line, that type of thing. First of all, try just dialing back in, and other than that, send a note out to us, and we'll try to help you and take care of any issues that you may have. Now, our presenters today, and can we move to the next slide, please? Our presenters today are from the Systems Alliance Company, also known as SAI, and they're the makers of the Acadia Policy and Procedure Application Environment. Our presenters are Mark Dabrowski, who's a Vice President of the SAI Digital Practice, and Joe Crone. He's the Vice President and CTO of Software Products at SAI. And each of those individuals will start the presentation with a brief overview of their individual backgrounds. So Mark, Josh, I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Thanks a lot, Dan. This is Mark Dabrowski. I lead SAI's digital practice, and my focus has been helping organizations use web technologies to improve and optimize their business operations and business processes.
And I'm Josh Crone. I'm responsible for software products here at SAI. So we typically focus on web content management systems. And I specifically have background in technical architecture and cross-functional teams, mergers and acquisitions as well.
Right. And just to start by providing a bit of a background in terms of what we'll be talking about today. The key topic here is implementing process change initiatives that stand the test of time. And one issue that we often find is when process change initiatives get started, a lot of energy, a lot of focus behind that, but those initiatives often lose steam over time. So we want to take a look at, well, what are some of the drivers for that? What are some of the root causes that these initiatives don't take root, that they ultimately fail? And beyond that, looking at what are some building blocks to ensure those initiatives are successful, and also looking at how we can use technology as an enabler to help the process change initiatives take hold and become a lasting part of an organization's DNA. And really just to give you some background on what got us thinking about this topic, we're a consulting and software products firm working with organizations across industries, many cases large organizations. And we've seen over and over again a pretty significant gap in the consistent application of process change across organizations, particularly large organizations. So some examples of that: working with a large software company that's trying to make the transition from on-premise software to SaaS software. Requires some significant changes to back office processes, billing processes, support processes, and just seeing some of the stumbles in that process of that transformation. And also, we've learned quite a bit from an initiative at one of the world's largest retailers, Walmart, by implementing enabling technology for their process, large-scale process change initiative, and lessons learned out of that initiative there. So wanted to share some of the learnings from that experience, and look at how we can potentially address some of these challenges in developing process change initiatives that would really stand the test of time. And as a starting point, just to really kind of set a baseline here, ultimately what we're talking about is really improving process and creating higher performing organizations. So to begin with, what do we mean by a higher performing organization? And ultimately that means an organization where there's a focus on decreasing waste and inefficiency, improving safety, reducing risk, with the ultimate goal, at least for for-profit organizations, of increasing revenue. And well, how do organizations typically do this? Some of you are probably very familiar with this graphic. It's really a fairly standard process of really identifying and creating optimized processes for the things we do, conveying that information to our staff, ensuring that our staff understands and is able to execute on those processes, and measuring the impact, gathering feedback, identifying any issues, and ultimately making adjustments to improve that process on an ongoing basis. And a big part of this is also ongoing reinforcement. So we're not just focused on pushing out a process and assuming it takes hold, but really reinforcing that process with our organization, with our employees long term. And that'll be a theme that really runs through our presentation here. And so, I mean, this is how we see organizations looking to implement process change, but really that's the theory. Oftentimes we see that the reality is a little bit different.
Yeah, so we'll talk about the reality a little bit. So if we go into an organization, oftentimes what we find is really a lack in effective process documentation or even execution of processes. So typically what we'll find, these 4 bullet points here, so critical processes just simply aren't documented. So there may be critical processes that are important to these organizations, and there's simply no reference document available. Maybe it's tacit information that's spread as tribal knowledge throughout the organization. There's simply no system of record for a lot of the process documentation. And then oftentimes we'll find that if the actual documentation exists, it'll simply be out of date or incorrect. Other cases, you may have actually very effective documentation, but folks just can't find it. For whatever reason, they're not aware of the systems where these policies, procedures, these documents live. So that is a challenge throughout an organization. And then the worst case of all is processes exist, people know about them, and then they simply choose to ignore them. And that's really a cultural change, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So now for the buzzkill slide. So really to highlight why policies and procedures are super important. We picked a couple examples. One of them hits close to home. So we actually are in Baltimore. A year ago, there were riots that erupted shortly after the death of Freddie Gray in police custody. So after the smoke had cleared, both literally and figuratively, there was an independent investigation to really see how things could have been done better in the face of this civil unrest. So a couple things that they found. In response to the riots that broke out, there were several changes in arrest policies. So something that a police officer may do on a day-to-day basis is making an arrest. In response to the riots, they actually changed the procedure and policies for making arrests, and it caused a lot of confusion. It caused a lot of second guessing in responding to the unrest. The other thing that was critical was there actually was no documented response plan. So Baltimore had riots in the 60s, as many other cities did, but since then it really hasn't been a focus in police work. So there were simply no good documented plans for responding to this type of civil unrest. And then another piece that's very important is facing a resource crunch. The Baltimore City Police Department recruited help from adjacent jurisdictions, and as a result, there was really no clear chain of command. So folks simply just didn't know, who could give orders and who to take orders from. So really it was a matter of policy and procedure information simply just not existing and not having sufficient training to respond to this type of civil unrest. So another example, so the Fukushima meltdown. So in March of 2011, an earthquake and tsunami triggered the flooding of the Fukushima nuclear plant, resulted in total system failure and leaks of nuclear material. Unfortunately, there was a huge impact to life in the Fukushima disaster, and a lot of that was simply because of failure of bad policies and procedures. So there was really no response plan. So again, just like in Baltimore, there were no actual policies and procedures for how to handle such a disaster. Compounding the problem was there's actually a culture of acceptance. So you kind of do things the way you've always done them. And we'll talk a little bit about reinforcement in a little bit, but that really contributed, significant negative impacts to folks. Was the fact that basically things, even if people knew something was wrong, they really couldn't question it because it was part of their culture, really ingrained deep into their culture. And then finally, there was a conflict of interest. So the safety team that was spun up at Fukushima actually had operational responsibility as well. And that was their number one responsibility, was to make sure that the money pump was running, so to speak. So a lot of the safety things that were critical to the organization, as we find out after the fact, simply just went by the wayside.
Okay. Well, enough of the doom and gloom. Let's take a look at an example of the process working correctly. So a case study here involving one of the world's largest retailers, Walmart. So they're focused on optimizing processes in stores. So at the time had just under 4,000 stores in the U.S., and the goal was really to improve overall efficiency. So look at how staff were spending 80% of their time and identifying those tasks and optimizing them. And the goal there was to ensure that at each individual store the work was done as efficiently as possible. So how did they go about that? So first of all, developing SOPs for those key tasks, and those were thousands of SOPs across operations within the store and the stockroom, etc. And one thing that they didn't want to do is just to create all these SOPs and have them sit in a SharePoint repository or in a binder in the back room and collect dust. They really wanted to make that content actionable and make sure that employees were actually using that content. So how did they do that? They employed web technologies. So fortunately, in the store environment, employees have access to quite a bit of technology, from POS devices, workstations in the back room, inventory guns that have web browsers on them. So they were able to create web-based content for these SOPs and push that out to these various devices, so that when an employee had a question, they didn't have to stop what they were doing, leave the sales floor, find a terminal, search for an SOP, figure out how to do the task, and then go back to the sales floor. They'd be able to bring up that content on their POS terminal or their inventory gun, very quickly find an SOP, and be able to execute on that in the midst of of talking to a client, of doing their work. So really, the goal of that was to eliminate really barriers for employees accessing that content. And in addition to just pushing out those best practices and making them very easily available, there was also a built-in feedback loop. So realizing that most of the best process improvement input comes from the folks that are actually doing the work. The web-based tool also provided a mechanism where employees could very easily provide feedback around those SOPs and feedback around if an employee has figured out a better way of doing that task, or if an employee's identified an error. That information very quickly is then posted back to the staff managing that content. Because again, at headquarters, we may not necessarily be as in tune with all the detailed activities and tasks at individual stores. So really that effort provided a continuous feedback loop to help drive ongoing process improvement. And the end result of this initiative was really a positive ROI was realized in a matter of weeks. And that, in a sense, can seem somewhat ridiculous because ROI in weeks is really hard to achieve. But when you think about the fact that we're talking about, at the time, over 1.2 million employees, so even improving their efficiency by really a fraction of a percentage has huge macro impacts on an organization that size. So bottom line, having those documented procedures and making them available in a right way had a significant impact on driving operational efficiency. And so, well, what are some of the key themes from these examples? Well, we've seen that some of the challenges that have come up include information that's just not readily accessible. It's hard to find. And part of that is that processes may be created, may be stored, but they're not necessarily disseminated to the folks that actually need it. In other cases, we have organizational, cultural, or people failures that we need to deal with. So we may have the tools at hand to be able to enhance our operations, but the organizational culture just hasn't caught up, or we haven't provided the degree of management and leadership to ensure that those procedures are followed. And part of the ongoing issue is that there may be policies and procedures that exist, but they're not necessarily being reinforced. So staff may not remember that there's a policy or procedure. As new staff is onboarded, that information may not be reinforced with those individuals. So there may be an initiative launched to create and document policies, procedures, but unless that information is reinforced on an ongoing basis, by leadership, it's just simply not going to stick. And the bottom line, what we're seeing is that a key challenge is that transformation and processes are either not fully developed and accessible or not well ingrained in the organization. And those are some of the key challenges that we see. And then really the real key question out of this discussion is to address some of these challenges that we see. And here we have our familiar fishbone diagram. And the issue that we're trying to address here is, transformation doesn't stick. Why is that the case, and what we can do to address that? And here we've identified some of the key hypotheses we see as, what are the drivers for preventing transformation from sticking effectively? And the bulk of our discussion here really will be diving into each one of these issues at a more detailed level to identify how they impact transformation efforts and what we can do to foster those efforts. And here we'll start with the first item.
Yep, so the first item is really about behavior change. It requires constant reinforcement. So think about any change you want to do, whether it's at home, at work. It really requires going through the motions over and over again to make it an ingrained habit. So think about a New Year's resolution. If you've ever spent any time at a gym, you'll talk to the regulars, and the first week of the new year, everyone will complain about the fact that they can't get on any equipment because all the New Year's resolutions folks are in there working out on their New Year's resolutions. First week is typically crowded. Second week, it's a little less crowded. Third week, even less, until the fourth week or the beginning of February, it's kind of back to normal, and it's all the regulars at the gym again. So why does this happen? It's a couple reasons, right? So first is there's a lot of motivation the first week. You've just made this New Year's resolution. You're committed to it. You're going to get up every morning, go to the gym before you go to work, and do all the things that are right. After the second week, as motivation starts to die off a little bit, third week, motivation dies off a little bit, it's easier to fall back into old habits. So really, until you've gone through and made it a part of your life and committed to reinforcing this new good behavior, you're going to default back to the old behavior, which was really been reinforced for probably the better part of your life before you've made this resolution. The same thing's true with really any kind of change initiative, whether it's a personal goal of going to the gym or some business transformation project. So if you've done a process the same way for 10 years in your job and all of a sudden you need to change it, there's going to be a period of time where you're just going to have to force yourself to do the work in the new way until it's been reinforced enough that it's second nature. So reinforcement's really key. And if we go to the examples that we brought up about how reinforcement had an impact on those cases. So first, if you think of the Baltimore riots, as I had mentioned, they changed some of their procedures at the last minute, particularly the arrest procedures and policies. The fact that they tried to do this change initiative when folks were stressed was bad enough, so they've got this really stressful situation, not sure what to do, and then they've initiated a change initiative without any sort of reinforcement. So the new policies and procedures weren't ingrained in the officers' minds, so really it made them struggle. Again, so reinforcement there, if there was a plan and they could have reinforced the new policies ahead of time, it would have made a big difference. And again, there was lack of training in civil unrest. So the focus post 9/11 for local police departments has typically been around domestic terror. So they really haven't trained on civil unrest because it hasn't been a problem for most cities since the 60s. On Fukushima, actually reinforcement had a very different impact, and that's the fact that the wrong behaviors were reinforced. So again, this culture of acceptance that said basically you don't question the status quo, it prevented folks from stepping up and challenging some of the things that were happening. So for the Walmart example, so where reinforcement makes a difference, so to give you a scenario at Walmart, a new associate, they may come in their first week, and the first couple days we'll be sitting in LMS sessions learning all of the procedures of Walmart, and let's say one of those days they go over doing a price match. So 2 weeks into the job, they may get someone coming in asking for a price match. The fact that they haven't seen that since they've gone through their LMS session and had it reinforced typically requires them to reach out to another associate or manager to figure out the procedure for doing a price match. So if we can give folks a way to reinforce that behavior after the learning, it really helps ingrain that learning deeper and allows them to be more effective a lot sooner. Then also from our own consulting experience, so again, we see very much the same thing that you see at the gym, is that when you start with a transformation effort, there's a lot of motivation at the beginning of the project. So you get lots of people on the same page working on it, but when the work gets hard, or you get a couple weeks out, or if you lose some of the champions of a project, they tend to falter because folks will default back to the old behaviors that have been reinforced over time. So another thing that we'll talk about, so the next piece, the next fishbone that we'll go over is availability of procedures. So you really, if I were to sum up this slide here, I would just say that you have to find it wherever you are with whatever you have. So if you've got procedure documentation that's out there, it's only available sitting at your desk on a computer and on a drive that might be challenging to actually navigate, you're going to have a hard time actually accessing and enforcing change. So, and to talk about a little bit more, so how do we find information when we're sitting at work? Really, there's two main places that you will get it. One is from other employees, and then others may be from distributed across various systems. So when you think about the tacit information that's in the heads of employees, it's really difficult to tap that, and it's probably the most valuable information that's in your company. So you have folks that are heavily invested in your organization. They know a lot about everything in your organization, very valuable. But if you're a new employee, identifying who these subject matter experts are, who to talk to, and their willingness to share this information all really impacts the success of a new employee coming in. So another problem that we see in the illustration that we have there of a typical file server directory structure is that it can be hard to navigate that. So unless you're very familiar already with your directory structure or organization structure, you're going to have a hard time finding this information. So again, to reinforce this, the information needs to be available wherever you are, whenever you need it, on whichever device that you have. So next slide, so we'll kind of compare this to how most folks find information at home. So really, if you think about it, the attitudes change from really kind of long-form learning to really an attitude of, why do I need to learn this when I can simply Google it, right? So information now, we've got so much information available to us, from a phone that's in our pocket. All of this information is instantly discoverable, so we can, search away, find anything that we need to. And it's always in short form as well. So, a quick video snippet may tell us something that 10 years ago, we may have had to read an entire textbook to get the information that we needed. And then also there's been a shift from large applications to really purpose-built apps. So really the focus here is really searchability, and long form is going away, short form is coming up, and Mark will talk a little bit about some of the reasons why we're seeing that happen. So this slide here, so this really highlights what we're seeing in consumer technology. So, as good as your systems are in your corporate environment, chances are they're not as good as the consumer technology that your employees have in their pockets today. And, whether you have a bring your own device policy or not, folks are bringing their own devices into your organization. They're used to using consumer tools. They're used to having nice, very purpose-built apps that really can make your corporate applications appear clunky and out of date very quickly. And another factor that we have to think about as well is the fact that we have an increasing mobile workforce. So all these factors are contributing to folks preferring to use their own technology over the technology that you provide. And a lot of this technology is non-standard devices. So these might be tablets and smartphones. So these are things you have to consider when you start to document your processes and document your policies, is they really do need to be available on just about every device that's out there. And the next slide really illustrates this point. So this is the statistics of web traffic, basically from the past several years, showing that the desktop market is really declining to the point where it's almost equal to tablet usage and cell phone usage. So more and more folks are opting to use their mobile devices that are in their pockets than using traditional desktop workstations. So if your content's not available on these devices, folks just simply aren't going to consume it. So why do these matter? So obviously, folks have high expectations of technology. The consumer devices, this consumer technology applications, generally are easier to use and better than the applications that you offer at work, right? And your content really needs to be available on those, because those are devices that folks are using.
All right. And beyond access to that content, the next issue that we want to explore is alignment of individuals' learning models with with how we're providing learning resources and content. And so, fundamentally, learning styles can vary. So some individuals prefer or learn more easily by seeing, some by reading, some by listening, others by kind of doing the task. That's the most effective way for them to learn. And really, when we're creating reference content, training content, we need to be focused on supporting multiple styles of learning. Unfortunately, the traditional format for most of this content tends to be text. So it's sometimes short form, sometimes paragraphs and paragraphs of text. And that tends to be not the most effective way to convey information. So when we're looking at documenting best practices, work instructions, we need to consider what's the most effective way to convey that information and for our employees to consume that information. And some of that looks at beyond providing step-by-step instructions, providing checklists, diagrams, video, so videos demonstrating how to perform a task, audio instruction, really making this content available in more than one format so that it is consumable by, effectively consumable by your audience. And with all of that, reinforcement is critical, providing this content in a format that can be used as a reference. So, for example, a half-hour long or hour-long computer-based training, probably not a great resource as reference material because that's not something that someone can check quickly or easily, versus a 3-minute video or a quick checklist if someone needs to reinforce their knowledge on performing a task. And so that brings us to just-in-time versus just-in-case training. Just-in-case training, we're referring to traditional training where someone is being put through, whether it's classroom training or a CBT, being provided with training that they may or may not use at some point in the process of them doing their work. That's in contrast to just-in-time training, which is as someone encounters a task they need to do that either they don't know how to do or haven't done before, they're able to access a quick reference resource for how to perform that activity. And so we're not suggesting here that one approach is better than the other, but really need to identify the optimal training mix. So for example, in environments where there's very significant employee turnover, investing significantly in just-in-case training, traditional training, may not be as effective as that short-form just-in-time training. And just a great example of where one may be more appropriate than the other. So, for example, say you want to figure out how to change the spark plugs on your 1997 Jeep Wrangler. Searching for how to do that on YouTube is a great resource. You can watch a 3-minute, 5-minute video and very quickly learn how to change a spark plug. Now, in contrast, if you're going to be removing someone's appendix, that's probably not the most appropriate venue for just-in-time training because there's a lot of foundational knowledge that's required in something like that. So again, both training approaches are very relevant, but we really need to make sure that we have the most appropriate type of training methodology for the tasks at hand. And in addition to that, regardless of what type of training is offered, having access to reference resources after that training is also critical. Because again, regardless of what that training is, you may be providing training that an employee is not really going to need or use for weeks or months. So having a very quick reference to help them remember and reinforce that training is absolutely critical. And a just-in-time training mechanism is a great method to do that, particularly for that traditional training. And much has been, beyond just general shifts in the training environment, much has also been written about how individuals from the millennial generation learn, work, communicate. And really there's been a pretty significant shift in how the millennial generation works compared to prior generations. One aspect is attention spans are shrinking. So actually an interesting study from Microsoft released last year looking at how attention span has changed over time. And also an interesting comparison in that so the attention span of a goldfish is roughly 9 seconds. And these days the attention span of most people in the U.S. tends to be 8 seconds. So putting things into perspective there in terms of how focused we are at any given activity. And so with this generation, with access, on-demand access to the web, mobile devices, there's this expectation of on-demand information, really the ability to be able to Google anything that you want to know at a moment's notice. And there's really a lack of patience. So individuals are not willing to spend time trying to locate the information they need. So digging through shared drives, intranets, folder repositories. If that information is not accessible easily, immediately via search, it's just not going to be accessed. No one's going to have really the patience to look for it. So we really need to make sure that we're attuned to those shifts. And now, beyond just providing the right types of information in the right format, we also need to look at motivation, or what's really going to motivate our staff to leverage the resources, the reference materials, the training aids that we're providing them. And first of all, that content really has to be appealing. It must be easy to consume and very simple to access and understand. Again, not digging through folders and repositories, but I want to be able to search and find the information that I want immediately. And that content also has to be aligned with the learning styles as we've discussed. So I need to be able to not only find this information quickly, but really consume that information quickly. I don't have the patience to sit there for half an hour watching a computer-based training module. I want to watch a 2-minute video, or I want to read a checklist. So very quick access to information and more multimedia. So definitely many studies have shown multimedia is much more engaging, and that information is retained much better than just reading lengthy copies. So video, images, step-by-step instructions, diagrams, and a very simple method to access. And reinforcing, again, ease of use. So removing any barriers to adoption. And one of the keys here is employees will tend to access resources, reference resources, work instructions, if they can do that without interrupting their flow of work. So without having to stop what you're doing, potentially launch another application or walk to a different part of the workspace to look up information. Just folks aren't going to do that. So the key is really to make that information accessible at employees' fingertips, to use an overused expression. But a big part of that is, as mobile devices have proliferated, to make that content easily accessible across those mobile devices. So typically a employee will have, whether it's a smartphone or a special purpose mobile device, easily at hand. Make that content accessible across those devices. So really limit the barriers to that information, and that will encourage and motivate staff to access that content. Next, beyond just simply pushing information to individuals, creating some additional motivation for that information to be read and understood. One quick example of that is requiring acknowledgement. So beyond just providing a repository of work instructions, when this content is pushed out, require that employees acknowledge reading it. So that creates a certain sense of obligation, so that an employee can't say, well, I didn't know that was the process, because at that point you have an audit trail of an employee saying that, yes, they acknowledge, they understand. Another aspect, another avenue for really encouraging staff to be part of the process is enabling feedback. So too often procedures, work instructions are created centrally at headquarters and pushed down to whether it's a retail store, warehouses, the workspace, and there may be some pieces missing. So the folks that are actually doing the work may have a better way of doing it. There may be errors or gaps in that process because there may be differences in how certain factories or how certain stores perform this task. So providing a simple mechanism allowing those doing the work to submit feedback is critical, both for helping us improve the process and also for really giving our staff ownership around the process, giving them input, giving them a voice. And that really, making them part of the process helps them to embrace that process. And one popular method to really encourage employees is to provide rewards to employees who provide input that helps to improve processes.
Yep, so the next thing that we'll talk about is basically the accuracy and relevancy of the documentation. So generally what we'll find is oftentimes the information that's out there may be inaccurate and irrelevant. There's several contributing factors that we found. So one of the things is that you could actually have multiple places to find the information. It's likely to be outdated, so nobody likes to update documentation. Oftentimes, what's happening in reality isn't reflected in the documentation, and also could be difficult to update, not reviewed, and in various different formats. And we'll go through each of these contributing factors here in more detail. So the first one is really about multiple sources of information. So really, if you want to have process information that everyone can reference, you need to have one system of record, or one version of the truth, as we say. So not only is this helpful for finding and consuming content, but it's also helpful for folks who are responsible for actually creating and updating content. So simply knowing where to find information and where to update information is oftentimes an easy thing to fix, but it's a really big hurdle in practice. So part of what happens by creating one system of record is it actually inspires confidence for folks who use the system. So if they're sure that this is the absolute right place to do this, to make a content change or to consume information, they're going to have confidence in the material and are going to be more likely to use it in practice every day. So another contributing factor is the fact that oftentimes the information itself can be outdated. And we're seeing this more and more. So really when you look at just about every industry now, in the effort of really doing operational excellence initiatives, they're starting to iterate faster and faster. And with these iterations, they're able to pivot and really make improvements over time a lot faster than they ever could if they tried to do some huge process improvement effort. And generally what we're finding is that they've had lots of success, but it's actually put a burden on the process documentation side of things. So if you're continuously tweaking the processes over time, if you don't keep your documentation and your work instructions, your SOPs up to date along with it, you're going to have real problems. So that is one big contributing factor to the fact that we are seeing a lot of outdated information. The other thing is actually we learn as we go along. So the illustration there of the ship falling off the Earth, unless that's a waterfall, we know better now that the Earth is indeed round. So information evolves. The documentation that supports it has to evolve as well. Okay. So next thing, Mark had brought up feedback earlier. So feedback is absolutely a great way to get folks to feel ownership and become part of the process of refining your documentation over time and refining your processes. But there's also, in addition to getting that sense of ownership throughout the organization, it's really great to harvest the information that's in the heads of folks who are putting your standard operating procedures into practice every single day. So these folks, they may read your SOPs that a subject matter expert has put together. They may have information that maybe your SMEs don't have. So harvesting this information as these SOPs are put into practice is really key to improving them over time. So really, whether it's a program, whether it's initiative that you have, or getting out on the field and getting feedback from the folks putting these things into practice really is essential to getting everyone bought into the process. Now this next slide here, so we used an image of a guitar for the feedback there. So interested in guitars, we talked about if Mark wants to change the spark plugs in his Jeep Wrangler, it's a YouTube search away. So I did a YouTube search for how to build an electric guitar. And I don't know if you can see the illustration or not, but we've got basically a stick, a board with some wires, and an AC plug. And that video, if you watch it, I encourage you to look at it, is this guy plugs it into the wall and he strums it, and of course there's a big electrical jolt and hilarity ensues, so to speak. So, this is really the drawback of I guess, the dirtier side of the feedback, and that is just getting crowdsourced information and relying on that to affect your SOPs. So what we can do to help that is build in some sort of approval process. So we've got this SOP together, so we have a subject matter expert, he's built an SOP that seems the way to go. We've solicited feedback from the folks who put it into practice. Now's the time to incorporate that feedback, but then get approval. Right, so you may have very real legal requirements with the SOPs and policies that you're putting together, so having a legal review. There may be a human resources requirement to review it. So setting up a really thorough approval process is essential to making sure that you're not creating a liability for yourself. So we think that the combination of feedback plus this approval process really is essential to getting to the one best way of doing things. So another hurdle that we find that really contributes to inaccurate or irrelevant documentation is the fact that folks actually see documentation as not part of the value chain. So they simply think of it as an overhead. So generally, if this isn't what you would call your daily job, you see it as overhead, you're less likely to invest cycles in actually updating or creating relevant documents. So really what we find is that you absolutely have to focus on making the process itself as easy as possible. So some of the things that we had talked about earlier, such as making it available on any device, making it available from anywhere, those come into play here to make it easier for folks to update the content, but also creating templates, right? So creating templates for folks to fill out, it absolutely makes it easier to fill it out. Now, whether that's a Word template, whether it's a built-for-purpose web application, all of those would very much help folks be motivated to go in and actually create and update their documentation. So the last piece here, another thing that can happen is sometimes SOPs or policies that don't often get looked at, they tend to be out of sight, out of mind, and they typically won't get reviewed as often or as thoroughly as some of the really key components to operating your business. And for those, you really need to have some sort of scheduled content review. So whether that's a recurring meeting on your calendar that specifies exactly when and where the documentation is that needs to be reviewed. And oftentimes we find that there's actually some regulatory requirements to have this as well. So building some sort of mechanism that reminds folks that it absolutely has to be reviewed, and there has to be some sort of proof that you've actually reviewed the document. We find that that's essential, again, particularly for some of the documentation that doesn't get touched very often. So to go back to why we use templates, so really the desire there is to get to a consistent format. So if you think about it, a template, it guides the people that are creating and modifying the content. It gives them, really just allows them to focus on the subject, the process or procedure that they are a subject matter expert of. So they can just get the content in there, not worry about formatting, because that's all been done for them ahead of time. So they focus on just getting the information that we need into this template, publish it, send it out to whoever needs to look at it, and then they can move on about the rest of their jobs. But also on the consumer side. So, if you think about it, if as a consumer, if I have a familiar format, I can at a glance bring up a document if I'm familiar with it and know where to find exactly what I'm looking for. And of course, we use templates all the time. Think about signing up for something on a website. You put in your mailing address, your credit card number. You can look at the template. The whole point of that is that you can fill in absolutely the most required information that you need in a format that works not only for you to fill out the form efficiently, but the person who's processing your order. So there's also in everyday life as well, we also use other sorts of templates without even knowing it. So the example I like to use is a recipe. And I've actually taken a very well-known recipe and I've taken the liberty of making it a little bit more concise. So this is not the format that we're used to. And I challenge you to know what it is at a glance looking at it versus the next slide. So this is the same exact recipe formatted in a way that's familiar to all of us. So at a glance, just by looking at the ingredients, you can see here that it's chocolate chip cookies, right? It's some sort of sweet thing because of the sugar and the flour, and the 2 cups of semi-sweet chocolate morsels kind of give it away. So again, that's the value of using a template. At a glance, anyone who's ever seen a recipe or two knows that when they see this slide here, they know exactly what to do. They've got all the things they need to complete the process. They've got the instructions on how to combine it together and how to bake it, and you can go on about your business. So really that highlights the value from the consumer side of using a very familiar template.
Okay. And the last piece, the last hypothesis we have on our fishbone here is that the execution of processes or procedures is not effectively measured. And so, fundamental aspect of process improvement is that you really can't control a process that you're not measuring. So you really need to understand kind of where you are, and you need to be able to measure your progress to your desired state. And so, what kind of tools and techniques can we use to accomplish that? So we've talked a little bit about acknowledgement already. So as we're pushing out procedures, work instructions, SOPs, ensuring that employees acknowledge that. So creating a little bit of a incentive for them to actually read the document, and also providing a degree of audit trail. That gets us part of the way, but really ensuring that our employees understand is really the critical factor. And acknowledgement certainly is a start. It's but it really checks the compliance box, but we need to go one step further, ideally. And in order to do that, requiring validation that employees actually have the knowledge. So, yeah, there's certainly we can't guarantee that just because somebody clicked the acknowledge box that they've actually read the document. And one method to do that, to ensure that your staff understand the procedures, understand the work instructions, is quizzing. So, and for that, we're not talking about having someone sit in front of a computer-based test for half an hour. It's pushing out a document, a procedure, policy, work instruction, and sending out a quick 5-10 question quiz with that. And that really accomplishes two things. One, if an employee knows that they're going to be tested on the topic, on the concept, they're more apt to actually read and understand the content. And second, you have positive validation when they complete the quiz that they've actually retained the knowledge. And they've taken the knowledge and retained it. And really beyond that also helps you identify any skill gaps if your employees are failing quizzes in certain topics. It can also help you identify any gaps in the training content that you're providing. So a very valuable tool to be able to validate that knowledge. Taking that a step further is task management. So not simply pushing out instructions, information, and assuming or hoping that your employees will actually leverage that information in their day-to-day work, but actually being able to electronically assign a task to an employee or multiple employees, associate that task with instructions on the most appropriate way or the best way to perform that activity, and then be able to track by input from the employee when that work is finished. Even potentially be able to receive verification. So a great example of that in the retail space, say I want one of my employees, or say I want employees at all of my stores to set up a display for Halloween. So I can send a task out to employees at all my stores to do this. I can associate a procedure or work instruction for how to do this correctly. And that could be a checklist, that can include video, photos, etc. And then I can also require employees acknowledge when they've completed that task, and not only that, but also take a photograph of the display they've set up and send it back to me so that I can verify that they've done it correctly. So again, taking this one step further, and that this approach definitely is not appropriate for every type of role, every environment, every process, but for critical activities does provide a mechanism to have very significant control over a process and positive verification around whether that's been completed properly or not. Next is reporting. So really getting a sense of, as we're creating procedures, work instructions, and other reference resources, getting a sense of, well, a variety of dimensions around that content. So being able to just see analytics. So who's looking at this content? Are my employees even accessing this stuff? What resources are being used frequently? What's not? In what context are these resources being used? So are folks accessing this content on their mobile devices while they're working, or is it being accessed from a backroom workstation? What kind of feedback is being submitted by employees? Keeping track of what documents have been acknowledged by employees. Even being able to report on review cycles. So one thing with any reference information, too often that information becomes stale. Processes change, but the documentation oftentimes doesn't get updated to account for that. So being able to have regular review cycles and being able to track, do I have procedures out there that haven't been reviewed or updated in a couple of years? So providing visibility into what we have in terms of assets, how relevant, how accurate it is. And last, employee proficiency, so being able to report on quiz results. So as I'm pushing out resources and information and knowledge, are my staff actually understanding and retaining it? So all critical information and gaining visibility into that is important to be able to really move the needle. And next is really looking at how we align the activities that we're performing with our organizational KPIs, key performance indicators. So ultimately, we're not improving our processes just for the sake of improving our processes, but it's really to be able to move our organization or move our business forward. So we really want to be able to answer, have we made progress? are our efforts making an impact on the business overall? So with any transformation effort, we want to ensure that we've identified ROI metrics, and then be able to really point back to those metrics after we've launched this process on an ongoing basis. So if our organizational goal is to improve our retail store processes so that we can get more work done with fewer employee hours, can we track that later? Are we able to track that? Yes, we're still getting the same work done, but we're saving 5%, 10%, 15% on effort required to complete those tasks. And finally, just as a quick wrap-up, so we've really focused on trying to understand what are some of the key factors that really prevent transformation from sticking long-term, and what can we do to really address some of those tasks, some of those issues. And here are some of the key areas that we see, the key elements that we see for being able to make transformation stick. So we have to make resources, reference materials, training content easy and easily accessible. We have to provide mechanisms to motivate our employees to actually leverage this information. And part of that motivation is supporting multiple learning models. So how can we create content that's engaging and easy to consume? We need to make sure that there's one centralized version of the truth. Not that we have 4 or 5 versions of that same SOP that have been created across the years in different places. The content has to be relevant and timely. So as our business evolves, we need to make sure that our training and reference resources evolve. And finally, we need to measure our progress and ensure that we're tracking of the key metrics that we need to track to be able to identify whether or not we're getting an ROI from this effort and whether or not we're getting a real impact here. And in a nutshell, that's our presentation. I just wanted to open it up for any remaining questions.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Josh. And that was a great presentation. Extremely interesting. And I think that it was something that can definitely help with an area of, we'll say, implementation of BPM, of transformation type solutions, because getting it to stick, getting people to engage is something that has historically, I should say, been an issue. Laura, I don't have a visibility of questions. Are there any questions?
I have not seen any come through yet, but we can give people a minute to type.
Okay. Anyone with any questions for Mark and Josh, please key them in right now if that would be convenient for you to do so. Again, as you think about the discussion today, and Mark and Josh have given us a lot to think about, as we start to think about that, you'll see that the email addresses for both Mark and Josh are up there. I would urge you to note them, write them down, and as you think about how you may apply some of the things or some information that you may need from this type of a discussion, and want to talk to experts in it, that as you go forward, as you start to look at how do you really make a change in your company stick and get people engaged to it. I'm sure Mark and Josh would be happy in the future to accept those phone calls and talk to you about how you may be able to succeed in ways that might not have been something you were thinking about.
We do have one question now. Is certification on your solution available to consultants?
Certification on, I guess the question is certification on our technology platform?
They said your solution, but I believe that's probably what was meant.
No formal certification on the platform, but the intent of the platform, it's a web-based SaaS solution that's designed to be very easy to use, and we work with individuals and organizations in the BPM space to leverage that as a tool in their initiatives.
Yeah, and happy. So yeah, as Mark had mentioned, so we spent a lot of time on the usability of the product. So as far as making it simple to use, you can go right to the website today, sign up and request a demo. Happy to give you a demo, answer any questions, and potentially provide training if you want to learn more about the software. And we can typically deliver training in a period of an hour, hour and a half tops, depending on how in-depth and detailed you want to learn about the solution.
Right. The purposes or the purpose of these webinars from ABPMP is to provide overview, to provide information, to help people understand topics, different types of tools, solutions that are available to help in those topics. So for additional information on either the topic or the products that are available through SAI, I would urge you to contact Mark or Josh directly. I'm sure they'd be happy.
And Dan, I'd add on to that too, that the intention of this is no matter what system you use, we do think that these values hold true as far as making a transformation effort a stick. These are common themes that we'd run across before we had a product. So whatever you decide, we still think that these are some fundamental values that really work in any platform. Obviously, we'd prefer you use ours, but absolutely, we think it goes beyond the product.
Okay, and the next question, if you had to choose which item in the fishbone is the most challenging for most companies, which one would it be?
That is a great question. So I think probably one of the most significant challenges is really the motivation aspect. So we can have great tools, we can have great resources, but in order to actually make those elements part of our day-to-day operations, part of our day-to-day process, ultimately we have to encourage our teams to actually use those tools and make it part of their process. And sometimes that's harder than in other situations. It really depends on just the overall organizational culture. So some organizations we find that really any change is very difficult to move forward. There's a tremendous amount of resistance, whether it's implementing a new process or a new tool, and really working through that and the communication mechanisms to help staff understand why this is better both for organization and for them personally is pretty key to adoption. So I would say that the motivation aspect is probably the most significant challenge.
Okay, I believe that may be all the questions we have at the moment.
Okay. Well, this is Dan. Once again, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar will be available through the ABPMP website. Give us about a week to get it out there. And please, let your colleagues know about it. Not only this, but I'm sure you'll find a wealth of information, training related information available through these different webinars that we've been creating now or holding for about a year and a half, almost 2 years. So with that, I'd like to once again thank Mark and Josh. The concepts and the discussion, excellent in my opinion. And with that, end the webinar for today.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks everyone for joining us, and Dan, thanks for inviting us.
Okay. That will conclude the webinar for today. Thank you all.